Next up, we have Dr. Stephen Chavura. He is an absolute favourite of mine for so many reasons. One of the intellects that I most enjoy sharpening my intellect on. He never disappoints. I'm not going to take any more of his time other than to say, please welcome Dr. Stephen Chavura.
I'll be honest with you, I want to hear the rest of what Matthew had to say. So thankfully, though, Matthew's going to be on again during a panel, so make sure you tell us exactly why so many preachers don't realise the political implications of the gospel. Because I was on the edge of my seat then, and then I heard my own name. That was terrible. Looking forward to hearing more from you, Matthew. Now, in terms of what I'm about to talk about, two books I would recommend if this is of any interest to you. A book written for the general public is one called The Air That We Breathe, The Air That We Breathe by Glenn Scrivener. The Air That We Breathe, and it's a history of of Christianity and political activism. And a more scholarly book, but one that's actually become a bestseller, is by Tom Holland, and it's simply called Dominion. And those are two fantastic books. If you're a reader, then Tom Holland's one will probably be fine for you. If you're an occasional reader, you might want to start with Glenn Scrivener's The Air We Breathe. I've been asked to speak about the historical track record of Christians standing up to tyranny. And indeed, you've got it throughout the Bible, but there are some general principles that come out in the Bible. I can't go through them all. I'll go through a couple today, and then we'll do a little bit of history. But, in a very, very famous verse is in Acts chapter 5, when Peter and the apostles are preaching about Jesus, and the Jewish authorities tell them to shut up. They tell them to stop. And very famously, Peter simply says to them, "We're not going to stop. We obey God over man. We obey God over man." And immediately what has happened there is that a vision of government has been established whereby government and God are not the same thing. We want to remember that in ancient Rome, Romans were commanded to see Caesar as Lord and God. Lord and God, and the tradition was that when an emperor died, he would become a god. And so Christ himself and also Peter say, no, the government isn't God, and God is above the government. Immediately, that creates restrictions on what government can do to citizens. And this sort of plays out in the history of Christianity. Now, I want to be very clear here. I'm not here to tell you that everything that Christians have done in history is great and hunky-dory. It's not. And I'm not here to tell you that all Christians have always been on the right side of tyranny versus righteousness. They have not. I'd be lying if I said otherwise. And the same goes for today, as we saw over the last 3 years. But I want to talk to you about some of many of the great times when Christians were and why that was the case. So a very well-known one occurred in 390 AD, and Emperor Theodosius, to punish those in Thessalonica for murdering a Roman general, sent his troops in and basically said, make an example of these people. And the troops went in and just started massacring people in Thessalonica left, right, and centre. And the great preacher St. Ambrose heard about this, and he went to Theodosius and rebuked him and said that he's not going to allow him to participate in the Lord's Supper, or the communion, until he repents. And the point is, again, Ambrose is spectacularly saying, just because you're emperor doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. There are actual laws above you that you must obey. Tertullian, as I mentioned yesterday, the 2nd and 3rd century theologian, was one of the first in human history to talk about individual religious liberty, that governments cannot just determine how everyone worships and punish people for doing otherwise. St. Augustine, the greatest early church theologian, saw government as necessary, but a necessary evil, and said that a government separated from justice is nothing more than a glorified band of robbers. And St. Augustine delighted. And the book to read for this is City of God, particularly book 19 in the City of God. And St. Augustine had a favourite story about Alexander the Great bringing a fleet of ships, I presume from Greece over to Persia. This fleet of ships, and the fleet of ships comes across this one little pirate ship. And Alexander the Great indignantly looks at the pirate ship and says, "What on earth do you think you're doing, plundering people on the seas?" And the pirate says to Alexander, "What are you talking about? I come with one ship and you call me a pirate. You come with 1,000 ships and they call you an empire. But we're basically the same." And St. Augustine he was very, very clear that the propaganda that governments put out for themselves is almost always completely wrong. That very often they are nothing more than bands of robbers, and that's pretty much how he described the Roman Empire. Christianity, historically, the legacy of Christianity and slavery is mixed, but I would also say historically the overall tendency in Christian history was the abolition of slavery. And I can't go into that in great deal, but what I will say is that even the most enlightened of the ancient people said that slavery was a natural condition. The Apostle Paul comes along and says something that was very, very unusual in the ancient world, and says, "Masters, basically treat your slaves well and give them what is just." Someone like Tacitus just saw slaves as complete scum. These were very enlightened people. Paul comes and says, "Treat your slaves justly, treat them well." Now, what happened over the course of history is that Christians came increasingly to understand slavery is actually an unjust institution. And so they began interpreting Paul's words, "treat them justly," as "set them free." And that's precisely, of course, what eventually happened. In the Middle Ages, some very interesting things are taking place in the Middle Ages. And what is going on in the Middle Ages is that the Christian theologians are writing a lot about certain concepts and ideals that would go to feed into modern liberal democracy. And a lot of it was in response to tensions between kings and popes, questions about how popes ought to be given the office of the papacy. Should it be by election or not? And the theologians got together and wrote a lot about this. And what they started doing was writing a lot about notions like government by consent. Legitimate government only being legitimate if it has the consent of people. They also started writing about things that we would today call individual rights and even human rights. So a lot of the notions that we just take for granted today, government by consent, individual rights, rather than just the... So in the classical world, the notion of a right and the notion of liberty tended to apply to the group. It didn't so much apply to the individual. So when an Athenian said, "I'm free," what he really meant was, the city that I belong to is not governed by any other city. But he didn't mean that I'm free to kind of live the life that I want to live. That was not the reality in the ancient world. So the ancients loved liberty, but not so much individualistic liberty. Individualistic liberty is largely something that comes from the Christian Revolution from the 1st century onwards. And again, if you want to learn more about that, those books I mentioned earlier. In the Reformation, Martin Luther, of course, stands and says, I know what councils have said in the past, but this is what the Bible clearly says to me, and I just can't go against what the Bible clearly says to me. Interestingly, St. Thomas More, the Catholic, he said the same. He said something quite similar to King Henry VIII. He said, I can't go along with you being the head of the English church. My conscience just won't permit it. So both Catholics and Protestants during the 16th century start talking a lot about individual conscience. We bag out the Puritans an awful lot. We like to call the woke these days, they're our modern Puritans. But I put it to you that we actually ought to be saying thank you to the Puritans for a lot, because it was actually the Puritans and the independent Protestants, particularly in the 17th century, that started really saying that in actual fact the notion of absolute monarchy is completely illegitimate, and the proper understanding of legitimate power are governments elected by people. And that really very much reflected the model of the Presbyterian Church, which they said they got from the New Testament. And it also, of course, the Baptists, Matthew will be very happy to hear, were deeply democratic in their church polity and said that the governments should reflect the way that God has organized the church, which is the congregation electing its leaders. And so again, there's a very strong tradition coming out of Puritanism in the 17th century, coming out of the Baptist and the independent tradition of preferring more democratic modes of government as opposed to absolute monarchies. And let me say, it is not an accident that America went on to become one of the earliest modern democracies, because it was largely settled by Puritans who believed in government by consent and not absolute monarchy. So the fact that Americans love liberty today, that is very much a legacy of the Puritan tradition. So, let's thank the Puritans more than we bag them out. But please continue to bag out the woke. I have nothing good to say about them. That's the first applause I've got at this conference, and it was for that. These conferences, I don't know. It's not like when I speak at universities. It's a very different feel here. You've all heard of William Wilberforce. I won't. Of course, William Wilberforce spends his whole life working against the abolition, working for the abolition of slavery. The slave trade is abolished in 1807. Slavery in the British Empire abolished in 1833. I mean, these are all examples of Christians standing up to tyrannical, unjust institutions and practices. But the other thing I wanted to make clear is that the way that we think about tyranny, the way we think about injustice, the way we think about human rights, the concepts that we use, they have very much been forged by Christian thinkers, So it's not just great Christians doing great things, it's Christian thinkers creating the very thought patterns that we all take for granted today. I wish I could talk to you at greater length about that. Obviously, I can't. Let's go to Nazi Germany. Of course, it's notorious that so many Christians, maybe the majority of Christians, were on board with Nazism. It's difficult to tell how many of them were on board because they were just afraid, and you can understand that many would have been afraid, and how many just really enthusiastically supported it. But even here, you had incredible Christians standing against it. Of course, many of you have heard of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, really a modern martyr who stood against Adolf Hitler and was killed in the last fortnight of World War II. Another one that some of you would have heard of, one of the great women of the 20th century, Corrie ten Boom. And all I will say at this point is go and buy her book, The Hiding Place, published in 1971. Corrie ten Boom and her family probably rescued about 900 Jews in Holland when they built a little room in their house to be able to house Jews. Some absolutely incredible stories. One is when every Dutch person was allowed a food ticket. And one day, she was hiding Jews, and she needed more than one food ticket. There was hardly any food to go around. People were it was getting to really, really starving conditions. And she went to one of the German officials who handed out food tickets, and he said to her, "How many do you want?" And she meant to say 5 for the members of her family, but she didn't even plan this, but out of her mouth came 100. And the man just gave her 100 tickets without asking any questions. It's just an amazing thing, and she documents this in The Hiding Place, another beautiful book for you to read. Of course, today, we had the COVID tyranny, and it was tyranny. It was a therapeutic, totalitarian, technocratic tyranny where we were whipped into a frenzy, where we turned on one another as a means of generating compliance, where we were made to feel absolutely afraid of something that was nowhere near as dangerous as we were led to believe. And I'm sorry to say that a lot of Christians did go along with that, but I'm also happy to say that when I look at the freedom movement in Australia, most of the movers and shakers were good Bible-believing Christians who realized that there is a God above the state and that there is much more to fear in our existence than something like COVID. And that gave me a lot of hope. Let me just say one last thing. So what I'm talking about, what is the legacy of Christianity in terms of standing up to tyranny? Well, three things I would say sort of motivated the people that I've spoken about. Number one is a kind of Christian humanism, that sees human beings as of dignity, that sees human beings as worth sacrificing for. Now, I think it's worth separating Christian humanism from secular humanism, and there is secular humanism, and it's got quite a legacy as well. But my fear with secular humanism is it's sort of unmoored or unanchored from Christianity. What it tends to do is start to gravitate towards things like eugenics, euthanasia, abortion. It doesn't necessarily have to do that. I'm not saying it has to, but what I'm saying is historically it tends to. And so I think that's a danger of merely secular humanism. And that's not to say there aren't good things in secular humanism. Of course there are, but I'm just saying I don't know that the secular part is enough. Of course, that's a debatable question. Obviously, the idea of a God over government. Remember, Jesus says, give your taxes to Caesar because the coin bears Caesar's image. But the really important part of Mark chapter 12, which we always forget about, Jesus says, give yourselves to God. Well, who bears God's image? We do. And so that is a very important chapter where, and this, in a sense, the essence of the Christian relationship with the state is there. You don't bear the government's image on you. The government doesn't own you. God owns you. And so that frees you from the government to serve God. Not to serve yourself, but to serve God over government. And that is something that is very dangerous to any tyranny. And finally, Christians, we all know that we will all have to give an account to God on Judgment Day. Thank you very much.